From WHQR Public Media, this is The Newsroom. I'm Ben Schachman. Thanks for joining us. On today's show, it's a conversation with new Hanover County Commissioner Dane Scalise. We're talking about taxes and government spending. Scalise recently penned an opinion piece in the Wilmington Business Journal, which we'll have links to on the show page, where he laid out a fairly simple argument. If property values are going up, and they are, taxes should go down. So we invited him here to the studio to unpack that idea and get into some of the granular details of the county's budgeting process, including where Scalise would like to trim the budget and where he'd like to spend more. This is our unedited interview recorded Friday, February 28th. Commissioner Dane Scalise, thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
So, the approximate cause of our conversation today is taxes. And we'll have properly introduced the subject ahead of time, but just for people who have not been paying attention to this, the county recently went through a revaluation process, which you've posted about on social media, where the average value, depending on how you slice that pie, of a property in our county has gone up around 60 to 63%. And this is the flip side to rising property values, which are good for families if the market stays stable, is that you're now looking at a potential increase in property tax. And this is what you've been commenting on, because if we stay at the current tax rate, and this is a huge if, and we're going to get into all this, right? But if we were to stay at the current tax rate, people's property taxes would go from around $1,200 a year, and that's just for the county. If you live in the city of Wilmington, you get hit twice. But just for the county, it would go somewhere around $1,200 a year to around $2,000 a year. So from $100 a month to $160 a month. Pretty significant increase. And so the county, you and your four colleagues on the Board of Commissioners, have an opportunity to decide what to do with the tax rate based on this new information. So I want to give you the chance here to sort of give your opening statement. What have you been saying on social media? Where do you want to see this thing go at a high level?
Well, thank you again, Ben, for the opportunity to speak with you and your audience about this important subject. Not merely posting about it on social media, I've also written an article that was published in the Greater Wilmington Business Journal entitled, "When Property Values Go Up, Tax Rates Must Go Down."
Yes, we'll have a link to that. It's a good piece.
Great. Thank you very much. And what I tried to do in this piece is to get out ahead of some of the dialoguing that is appropriately necessarily percolating as a consequence of just what you described. So let's back up just a little bit and say North Carolina law requires counties like New Hanover to reevaluate their property at least every 8 years. We elect to do so more frequently every 4 years, and the idea behind that is maybe property values are going to go way up, and if they go way up over the course of 8 years and you haven't done a reval, that is going to create a huge pain point. Well, sometimes whenever property values jump up in the way that they have in New Hanover County, even over 4 years, it has the potential to create a huge pain point. And to your point, we have a tax rate that is currently set from those 2021 reval numbers, and it is currently, as of this budget year, 45 cents per $100 of value. And whenever you have an increase like you've just described with these property values and you don't adjust the tax rate, it creates the potential for quite a bit more revenue for county government, maybe as much as $150 million. As well as increased tax bills for the citizens who are property owners of residential commercial property throughout our community. And it's not just the people of Wilmington who would have a double taxation. Of course, there's the town of Wrightsville Beach, Carolina Beach, all of the municipal areas that would potentially see both their tax rates within the municipalities where they live as well as the county at large increase should we not make adjustments. So my goal in the piece, and my goal, quite frankly, in the budget discussion that we're underway on right now, is to try to figure out what is the appropriate level that the tax rate should be set at for the coming fiscal year, taking into account all of the things that we are statutorily required to pay for, as well as some of the other services that I believe are appropriate for us to pay for, and maybe some other services that I would prefer for us not to pay for. So I'm trying to offer up a discourse on this very subject, in part because if I don't, it is left entirely to staff to come up with an idea of what should the budget be? What is it supposed to look like? And that's good. I'm glad that we have a very talented staff at New Hanover County. I think they do a very good job of trying their best to interpret what it is that the elected commissioners want them to do. But it's also my job to lay out an idea for what I think we should do, and then try to lobby my fellow commissioners to come over to my way of thinking, and then that will influence the way that staff ultimately reflects and works on the budget that's ahead.
So, and I'll get to this idea of how staff kind of put together these budgets in a minute, because I think that's important to talk about. I do want to go back to 2021, before your time. When
I was alive in 2021.
Before your time as a commissioner. My apologies. Yes. You're a fresh face in politics, but not that fresh.
Mm-hmm.
So in 2021, I think the county left a lot of people with a bad taste in their mouth because it was after a reval, like the one that's happened this time, and they went public with this message that they had lowered taxes. Now, they decreased the tax rate, but if your tax bill had been $1,000 the previous year, it went up because your property was now worth more. Even though tax rate was a little bit less, it hadn't been cut down to what staff call revenue neutral, right? And so I think that's ringing in people's heads a little bit. People forget, but if you pay a tax bill and it jumps, maybe you don't forget.
Right.
So that's one of the conversations I think the county staff will be having as we go forward. But there's kind of two versions of this, and correct me if I'm off base here. One is just straight up revenue neutral. Your tax bill, where does the tax rate need to be? How many cents on $100 of property value does it need to be so your tax bill doesn't change at all? And then there's something else staff has put forward, which is that they're claiming based on inflation that to do basically the same job, they need $68 million more. So there's sort of like an adjusted revenue neutral.
Sure. I think that revenue neutral, properly understood, should include some inflationary amount. And I'm just talking definitionally. Because, in fact, there are inflationary pressures that exist in county government as well as every other enterprise in the United States across the globe. And it is undeniable that the cost of doing business for the county as well as any of the other businesses, individuals that are here in this community and beyond has gone up since 2021. Inflation is real. And the number that the county is suggesting is inflationary is somewhere in the early or rather low 20s. And I'm not entirely sure that I am confident in that number. It's not to say that I don't believe them. I just am not quite sure that I understand that piece of the equation just yet. It's part of the process that I'm going to have to work through. But I want to be clear, I don't deny that there are inflationary increases that will make operating the county at the same level that we are operating at based on the 2021 numbers probably not feasible. So to suggest that the rate is going to be exactly the same, or rather the total cost to you, the consumer, the taxpayer, is going to be exactly the same, I don't think is a likely outcome in this scenario. But I also want to suggest that that number can be minimized, maybe to the point of pure revenue neutral, or at least as close to it as possible by getting the government honed in to the highest and best degree possible on the provision of what I like to always talk about, core services, and avoiding some things that are perhaps not core services. That's the goal that I'm trying to get across. How do we ultimately minimize that inflationary impact so that your bottom line amount that you're paying on your tax bill is either as close to the number that it is right now, or if we're going to go up, it's because we're justifying it to you in the way that we must do this because we are statutorily required to provide certain of these services. So that's what I'm trying to get dialed in on, and that's going to be the challenge over the next several months.
Yeah. The county does have like a sort of interactive tax calculator.
Cool new tool, actually.
I played with it this morning. It is a lot of fun, and it shows you how tiny tweaks in the tax rate really have significant impacts. So we're talking about pennies of tax rate per $100, but every penny really we're talking about $5 million.
That's right.
So when you say, "Oh, I want to cut taxes by 1 penny," that's $5 million, right? So I just want to throw out some numbers just for context here, courtesy of the county. So this is where we are now with our tax rate. So New Hanover County is, I believe, 16th lowest out of 100 counties. That's obviously going to change as other counties decide where they want to go. Those taxes range from like 27 cents to 99 cents on $100. Ours is 45 cents right now, and the average is 62 cents. That's not apples to apples. Different counties have different responsibilities.
A penny is worth more in different counties as well.
Exactly.
Because we are a fairly well-to-do county, the value of a penny is worth significantly more in New Hanover County, which allows us to have robust services, generally speaking, at a lower tax rate.
Exactly, yeah. So I don't want people to say, like, hey, why does Onslow have this tax rate and we have a different tax rate because property in Onslow maybe not worth as much. The other two figures I want to throw out here is that the pure revenue neutral rate, right? Not talking about inflation. So this is kind of a fictitious, a fantasy number, but that would be 28 cents.
Right.
And the adjusted one is closer to 36 or 37 cents. In either case, a decrease from our current 45-cent rate. So I don't know if you have this number in your head yet, but do you have like a tax rate number you would like to be able to get to as like an aspirational goal?
Yes, I do. Although it's subject to discussion and negotiation with the other four members that make up the Board of Commissioners. I would say that my goal is to get as close to that 28-cent number as is possible. I would hate to put an exact dollar amount or penny amount on that because I'm sure it will be subject to negotiation, but somewhere between 30 and 35 cents I think is achievable. I would prefer for it to be closer to, again, the 28 cents number. Trying to be realistic, I don't think 28 cents is achievable. And I'm just talking about let's cut out all of the fat that I don't care for. I don't think that we're going to be able to do that relative to inflation.
And that's before you go into a room with four other people who might have different ideas.
That's exactly right. And so leaving all of those variables out, that's where I'm at. Where we include those variables, all I can say is let's see.
So let's get into some of the things that you outlined in your Biz Journal article about places where, at least to start, right, you'd like to look at some cuts. There's DEI, non-agency spending, and then sort of general government operations. For the sake of brevity and civility, we won't rehash the DEI stuff.
No, we can talk about it. It's no problem. Look, let me be clear, because one of the things that happens whenever you talk about complicated subjects, and there's no question that DEI is a complicated subject, it creates a lot of emotional reaction in people, irrespective of where you are on the spectrum of belief or disbelief in this concept. I personally absolutely, strongly believe in fairness and equity for all citizens across New Hanover County. I have a different policy prescription for how to achieve it than some others. Some others believe that by the creation and proliferation of the DEI department, you are necessarily increasing fairness and equality in the community. But that is ultimately an assumption that is, in my opinion, sometimes hard to pin down, sometimes hard to quantify. And I also have, as you and I have discussed offline, some concerns about the legality of DEI in New Hanover County, as well as the potential impact that it could have on the receipt of federal and state funds to the New Hanover County government. So whenever I consider all of these factors, my recommendation is let's please consider no longer funding this department. I'd be happy to provide other opportunities within New Hanover County government to the 6 employees that we have within the DEI department, should they find themselves willing, should they be qualified to fill those roles. But if their continued function is going to be on the subject of DEI concepts, I cannot be in favor. And I'm going to continue to speak out against it. But I wish that we could also understand that we can talk about these things without assuming the very worst about one another. My goal here is actually to enhance fairness, to enhance equality. I just have a different idea about how to do it than perhaps you or some of your listeners. But there are many other people in the community who agree with me on this subject. I have looked in some of the polling on this. I'm sure you have too. The public's fairly divided on this subject.
I actually just read the most recent readout from the White House, actually, that shows how divided people are over this. And I think there's a lot of nuance, and maybe this would be a conversation for another time, but I think there's people who object to DEI, people who feel like who aren't offended by DEI, but maybe feel like it's overemphasized. and there's people who probably feel like the goals of DEI could be achieved in other ways. And I think all of those are fair, and the polling shows we do not agree as a nation about this. I've seen internal studies from the city of Wilmington, for example, that show government employees don't totally agree on this. I'd say a good 20% of city of Wilmington employees, or at least 20% of the responses in a survey they did a couple of years ago, had some issues that sound like yours.
Right. Some of the same to be said about the Cape Fear Public Utility Authority, a body that I serve on. Some public comments that actually were received in connection with a study that they did. And then I would just offer to you that there are some individuals who have reached out to me privately, employees of CFPUA, employees of the county government, who have said, I'm afraid to answer my true opinion on this subject because I don't want to experience repercussions from my employer. And that's not a good thing in my estimation. We should be able to speak openly, honestly with one another about our policy preferences, all of us, without fear of repercussion.
I agree with you. Unfortunately, I feel like when we talk about DEI, we're sometimes having kind of a shadow conversation about racial politics and racial dynamics in the country, and that's tense, and that can make people feel uncomfortable. I would also just note that there are also employees in the county who feel like they've been helped by DEI, or
Sure.
feel like they have been in situations where their voice in the room hasn't been heard. I don't want to carry the water for them. That's a debate for the commissioners. But I do think, to your point, not everyone agrees. Also, to your point, as I think you've said in the press elsewhere, that's more of a philosophical issue for you than a financial issue for you. This is 0.1%, more or less.
$630,000 at present in
It's
the
not
budget.
nothing. Not nothing.
It is a substantial amount of money, but it is also not the primary motivator behind my decision-making here. I would offer, though, that if we are going to get into the dollars and cents of it, the prospect of losing federal and or state funding is significantly more than $630,000.
The school district is dealing with that right now.
Yes, and I think that we're going to continue to have this dialogue. I don't want to make this the entire subject of our discussion today, but I hope that we can learn how to better speak to one another about these complicated ideas that no doubt get into the complicated subjects that you've alluded to.
Yeah. So let's move on, though, to some of the other things you've identified. Non-agency spending is another one.
Yeah.
And again, this is not a huge part of the county's budget.
$1.6 million.
I believe the requests most recently were around $2.4 million, and the county has consistently put out around 1.6.
The last 2 years, I think that we've allowed for $1.6 million in funding, although the requests have been, over the last several years, significantly more than that.
Now, as a reporter, I've heard criticisms of this system, that it is a little bit of a who-you-know club. I've heard that people frustrated that the county is kind of picking winners and losers in the nonprofit world. I've also seen people jump the line, as it were. Relatively new nonprofits getting funding because they had the sponsorship of a commissioner, without naming names. I think some of those grievances are legitimate. So I've heard, criticisms of the process. Mm-hmm. And the other thing I've heard people say is, and these are usually fiscal conservatives, is that we are moving towards a place where we will have $85 to $100 million every year coming out of the endowment. And as I've written elsewhere, I believe they will have trouble shoveling that much money out the door. Does it make sense for county taxpayers to continue funding this program?
My argument is no, as I outline in my article. I would prefer for these various nonprofits, many of which I do consider to be deserving. Easter Seals is a great organization, just to call out one, but I could go down the list. They're doing good work, but the sale of the hospital created an opportunity that is unique in this community. It allows for the funding of organizations like this through a officially non-governmental entity that is expressly designed, purpose-built for grant making. So my strong preference would be to indicate to the endowment, indicate to these nonprofits, I do not think that the county is the proper source of your funding this year or moving forward, and we'll see what happens with that negotiation that is going to occur. But I would like for them and the endowment to be thinking about how they can be better integrated with one another, because it truly is, in my estimation, not appropriate for the taxpayer to underwrite preferential treatment to some nonprofits to the exclusion of others, because there ultimately is, even though there's a process, we have a non-county agency government organization committee that we set up that evaluates and makes a recommendation to the Board of Commissioners. It's supposed to remove us from the politics of it, but I think that you and I both know that you cannot remove politics from a political institution. If we're voting on something, politics is involved. So I would like for us to figure out how we can better move the funding of these organizations, many of whom I believe are deserving, to the endowment. And we only are going to make that happen if somebody like me stakes out a position and says, this is what we need to be talking about.
So 2 quick follow-ups here. One is that, to your point, it is supposed to be sort of a re-review process every year. But clearly there are some establishment nonprofits that get funding every year.
Yes.
And from what I know about nonprofit life, I work for a nonprofit here. You come to rely on that. If New Hanover County has given the Carousel Center or Coastal Horizons, excellent institutions doing good work, but if every year they're getting, say, $50,000, in the budgeting process, you're probably thinking, okay, we can count on that. And maybe it'll go up and down a little bit. But I have heard from nonprofit world writ large a lot of uncertainty about the endowment, and as it's still finding its feet and making that jump from county funding to endowment funding, I think that's daunting for nonprofits.
I'm sure.
Where a minor disruption over 1 year could be what causes you to lose some of your most talented people. Mm-hmm. So are there any ways in your mind of building that bridge, whether that's having maybe the endowment come and sit in on one of these budget meetings?
Well, I'd love for them to. And of course, I'm regularly in communication with endowment staff as well as endowment board members to encourage them to regard my opinion. At the end of the day, it's just an opinion. They don't have to listen to me. They sometimes do, they sometimes don't. It really depends on what it is that they think is appropriate. But I'm going to keep doing that over the course of this budget cycle, and if ultimately I'm not successful in shifting that funding source from the county to the endowment this year, I'm going to continue to endeavor to do it. And I would hope that it would at least be suggestive to some of these nonprofits that we need to be thinking about this as a possibility, and we perhaps need to join Commissioner Scalise in his advocacy, because if we are going to be able to find this funding, maybe we can use our influence. In some situations, it's quite considerable to convince the endowment to play ball on scale. And I would just also offer that even though this is perhaps not so obvious, the more money that I'm able to keep out of the government's hands and into the pockets of the taxpayer, the more that they are able as individuals or business owners to be charitable with those dollars. I know that there are plenty of people in this community who are individually, personally, very charitable, and perhaps they would be more willing to be charitable if they knew, for instance, that the government wasn't acting as this backstop, that the government is no longer in the business of picking and choosing favorites on this non-county agency funding basis, and they are going to have to put their dollars to work, put their own voices to work to support the work that these organizations do. And again, I would just also encourage these organizations that they should be reaching out to, and I'm sure that they are, these individual donors to help to fill whatever gaps that are there.
It's hard to say that the gospel of wealth view that you're kind of alluding to here is Pollyannish, because WH Care relies on that. Mm-hmm. So I know that there are generous people out there, and I also know that fundraising does sort of wax and wane with the financial situation, with the market, with the tax rates. So the last thing I want to get to here, so you answered my second question, by the way, which was how much influence can the county have over the endowment if it came to some of these maybe longtime partners that you guys have been funding through the non-agency funding process?
Let me just follow up with a little bit of a primer on this. I think that you know this very well, Ben, and many of your listeners do too, but not everybody does. Whenever New Hanover County sold the hospital and created the endowment, it did retain some power in the form of appointment of individuals to the endowment board. But that's sort of the beginning and end of the influence that continues on with regard to the county and the endowment. They are their own body. They make their own decisions, even though these are public dollars. And I absolutely believe that. These are public dollars. They're not technically legally public dollars anymore. They belong to this endowment, and they get to decide based on their own rules how they're going to spend that money. So my job, and I do take this job very seriously, is to serve as advocate for what I think the proper expenditure, proper disbursement of these funds goes to. And I'm going to keep doing that in instances like this. But at the end of the day, it's their call. And similarly, even though this is not really what we're here to talk about, because I get a lot of this, and this is a big can of worms, the hospital is no longer run by New Hanover County.
I see the emails. I know what you're alluding to.
Right.
Yeah.
And I will say, I communicate directly with hospital leadership every time somebody brings a complaint to me. They have been responsive to the items that I have sent over their way, but we don't actually have much of a mechanism to control a private entity in the way that it operates. So I'm an advocate in both of these situations, and I will remain one, and I encourage the public to also advocate for the things that they think are important. That's how you ultimately are going to be most effective.
Okay, so I want to get to the last potential area of cost cutting that you highlighted, which I think is the trickiest, not for political reasons, but for logistical reasons.
Yes.
And that is general government operations. And I brought an old friend, if I can.
The binder.
The binder. So this is a binder that you requested, and I believe Commissioner Rob Zappel requested last year. I requested one too because I didn't want to be left out.
Yeah.
And I got to tell you, having gone through this thing, and I'm curious what your experience was like, I found this is a couple, maybe 100 pages. I found it largely inscrutable.
It was a little bit light, a little bit less than what I was hoping that it would be.
What were you I think what you were hoping was what I was hoping
I want to be as granular as possible.
Like staplers.
Yes, I literally want to be able to see, here's every minute detail about what we're spending money on, from operation, from subscriptions to various services, and instead there are just line items. And probably this is the digestible version that most people would want to see, but whenever it's my responsibility to make sure that we're as honed in as we can be, that's how I view my role. It's not quite the level of detail that I was hoping for, and it made my efforts to pinpoint some areas where savings might be had more difficult than I would hope for. It's for that reason that I'm suggesting that there are perhaps qualified professional third-party entities who are in the business of providing audits. May be appropriate to bring someone like that in to take a look at the granular detail and determine whether or not we are in fact doing all the things that we should be doing, and perhaps make some recommendations about some things that we ought not to be doing.
I can say I've had this conversation a lot over the last couple of weeks for obvious reasons.
Yes.
That I will now make explicit, is that I've spoken to a lot of liberals and Democrats who are very on board with the idea of having some sunlight shined on the finances of the federal government. This has been in the news. They are not enthused that Elon Musk is the person doing this.
I understand.
As one person said, I've seen Tom Tillis respond to some constituents talking about how we should be careful and mindful, and a chainsaw-wielding ketamine enthusiast is not what comes to mind when some Democrats think about this. But in general, I think there's a lot of bipartisan support for the idea of streamlining government. I think two of the issues are, one, a lot of times we don't know what the government is spending until after they've spent it. You can get sort of this adjusted year-end report, and then you can see what you and I both wanted, which was how are we getting the ultra-deluxe staplers, and do we need those?
Right.
Are we getting the $5,000 toilet seats at the Pentagon, basically? That's the issue number one. And issue number two is who can actually help read this, specialized bureaucratic language of budgeting in a way where the public and the elected officials can make sense of it and say, that feels like a place where we could tighten up.
Right. And I should also add, Ben, I am in no way suggesting that county staff has ill intentions.
Not a parasite class.
No, certainly not. They are hardworking, talented people. And I want to specifically call out the county manager, who I think is a very talented and intelligent man who is doing his level best to navigate the politically treacherous waters of a county commission that changes its partisan designation in terms of the majority on a regular basis. There's an ever-shifting cast of characters. He somehow managed to be the manager since 2012, and I think he's done that by and large because he's tried hard to respect the will of the majority or greater of the commission, not wade into his own personal political preferences. But it is also inevitable that after you've been somewhere for a long time, things start looking perhaps somewhat the same. You fall back on old habits. It's really just a testament to what happens to all of us in institutions. Institutional growth is almost inevitable, and especially so if left unchecked and you don't have a third party to periodically come in and say, are you sure about that? This is, I think, an appropriate inflection point for us to consider asking somebody, again, a highly professional entity that perhaps all 5 of us could agree on, to come in and provide that evaluation.
I will say I have seen year after year where the default mode of the county is to grow to the level where department heads feel like they're doing their best work. I know what I would bring to my general manager to give to our board if I was asked, Ben, what's a good budget for you for the newsroom next year? It would be larger than some of my board members might want.
Right.
And so it is up to my GM and then up to the board to say, that's not reasonable, right? Or can we accomplish the goals that you're expressing in dollar amounts in a different way?
Right.
So that is the nature of government. I take your point. I also think, part of this is that the budget that comes to you is not fully baked, but largely baked. And I think some of the things that you laid out that you would like to see more emphasis on: law enforcement, first responders, senior resources, sustainability, which is green space and creative ways to make development work without driving people insane. That's a level of okay, well, we might need to send this cake back into the oven.
Right. I think that that's true, although I want to, again, give the county manager some credit, because after I published this article, and I didn't speak with him about it at all, I just wrote my thoughts, published them, we spoke about it after the fact. He said, thank you very much for putting your thoughts out there. Very frequently, we are having to do a bit of guessing about what we think that the board wants, because the board, either individually or collectively, does not take the time to necessarily inform us of what it is that they'd like us to do. And they piece it together based on conversations that they have. And I don't mean this as a disparagement toward anybody, but I mean, not everybody takes the time to say, here's what I want the budget to look like.
Yes. One former city manager described this as being the person to whom it falls to cook Thanksgiving dinner. And you hope that some people like yams, and you're like,
right.
But sometimes you're going to screw up. You're going to put, you're going to do that green bean casserole.
Oh, actually, that's like my favorite thing. I love green bean casserole.
See, some people will like it. Other people, me, would be like, you're fired from cooking dinner in the future. So
only fair.
I take your point. And also, to your point, County Manager Chris Coudray is a survivor. The board has looked it's had a lot of different incarnations over the years. This is a more fiscally conservative board than, say, in past years. So that might be a change for some staff people. I do have two quick questions about that I've gotten from listeners.
Sure.
That I want to put to you. One is about renters. So a significant portion of our population are living in rental units, and they are in effect paying taxes, right? That's been factored into their rent.
Mm-hmm.
But when you cut taxes, I feel like they're unlikely to immediately see the benefits the way that homeowners are. Has there ever been a conversation for a mechanism to help those people, or is that just part of what it means to be a renter, not a homeowner?
I think, unfortunately, it is part of the reality of being a renter and not a home and or property owner, because this includes commercial property as well. There might be a different mechanism that would exist that would allow us to spread the taxing requirement and obligation over different members of society than it is presently comprised. This is the standard in North Carolina. This is primarily how local governments fund their operations, is through the taxation of property owners. And there are some other, obviously, revenue streams that we receive through sales tax and the like. But the primary source of revenue comes from property. And we'd have to have a complete overhaul of the current system to make different what we currently are basing our taxing structure on. And even though I am completely sympathetic to the argument that you just advanced, they are in fact not paying property taxes other than through the payment of their rental amounts, which I understand are too dang high in many instances. And that gets into a whole separate argument about how we get property rental rates down. Some would argue that you just build. I don't quite fall in that category. I don't know that just unlimited building is going to help you to achieve lower rental rates. It might in some instances help, but you probably have to do some other things that the county has periodically tried to do in connection with workforce housing. And there's a hybrid approach, I'm guessing, that is going to end up being the best way forward. But there is not much that I can offer to those folks who posed that question, because you just aren't taxed in the form of your property tax directly unless you are, in fact, a property owner.
Yeah, and to your point, I want to make it clear. Yeah, I'm not suggesting New Hanover County is in any way like uniquely singling out renters. That is how government works. You pay your taxes through your property. So
right.
The other question I've heard from folks is about economic development.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think this one has a particular partisan topspin on it. It's just I've heard mixed feelings on the left, I've heard mixed feelings on the right about whether or not this should be a core service, to use your phrase. Things like Project Grace and the Government Center, which involved a private component, compelling argument to be made that both of those projects helped revitalize underused parcels of land and possibly could trigger, sort of a chain reaction of economic development. On the other hand, I've definitely heard from people who felt like the government's job is to build libraries, build government facilities, and let private industry do what it wants to do. Not trying to relitigate those two projects, but just as examples.
No, they're great examples.
So going forward, how do you see the role of economic development as being or not being a core service?
So if we're able to go up to that 30,000-foot view, and we're talking about the political spectrum, there are people who believe that the government should handle literally every aspect of government, economy, everything that you can imagine.
The communist hellscape.
Right. I would not use the word hellscape, Ben. I'm more gracious than that. People have their opinions, and they're entitled to them. And then you have anarcho-libertarians who don't want the government to exist in any role, form, fashion. I am neither of those things. I genuinely and sincerely believe that government is necessary for the health and welfare of the population at large, and its only real challenge is getting that dialed in to the proper level. So all of that to say that I believe that there are instances where the government's involvement is appropriate, to include building infrastructure, to include funding schools and paying teachers well as senior services, all the other items that I pointed out in my article. Part of my argument is to say, if we get lean in areas where it's not our proper function, we can get better in some other areas that is our proper function. But that still leaves a sort of nebulous middle ground on some things like P3s, public-private partnerships. And my test for whether or not a P3 is a good proposition for the county is, do I anticipate that the public's investment in this concept will provide a sufficient return on investment? And if the numbers and estimations, as best as we can tell, show that, then I'm generally going to be supportive of that as an idea. No, not in all instances. There are some where it doesn't make sense. But at least in the instance of Project Grace, one of the things that I thought was really wonderful about the project is that it took this entire city block that was underutilized. It allowed for us to build a purpose-built library museum in the heart of downtown, not only for the benefit of the people who come and visit us from out of the area, but also for the large number of citizens who live in immediate proximity to downtown. They don't have a nice library and museum like some other parts of our community. I thought that was a really great opportunity. And then simultaneously turning over a separate portion of the block to the private sector to become something that would ultimately go on the tax rolls, that would have these property tax values assessed against them, would help to create over time some revenue that inured back to the benefit of the government. So is it a perfect system? No, I'm not suggesting that it is, but I think that on balance, it does create a good opportunity for us to achieve some public investment as well as realize some additional revenue through the private sector. And if we can figure those out from time to time, I'm probably going to support them. But if they don't make sense, I'm going to approach it in the same way that I'm approaching this year's budget. I'm going to do my due diligence, and I'm going to make sure that whatever tax dollars are being spent are sensible to what I believe are the best benefit of the public, and hopefully I get it right. I am indeed a human being. I don't always get it right, but I have a sincere effort and belief structure that I think keeps me generally pointed in the right direction. Of course, I welcome feedback. People can agree, disagree with the way that I approach. I try, and I think that you see that I'm pretty responsive to the public that reaches out to me. And I'm going to try to be as transparent as I can about my thought process. It's why I wrote this article. It's why I've come to talk to you today. I think it's one of my obligations to the public is to explain why it is that I'm advocating for the things that I'm advocating for.
Well, I appreciate you doing that. I appreciate you being here today to sort of flesh out some of these ideas. For those playing along at home, you guys are meeting next week for the next round of budget talks?
We are not meeting next week. Today is the 28th of February, and we would normally meet in the following Monday, but we are going to be up in Washington, D.C., and I'm going to be advocating for some federal dollars to come back to New Hanover County.
Well, Godspeed.
Yes, sir.
Commissioner Dane Scalise, thank you for your time.
Ben, thank you for your time.
All right. Well, that's it for today's show. I'm Ben Schachman. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join us for the next edition of The Newsroom.